Greetings, friends, and thank you for inviting me to speak with you. I wish I could have joined you in person. I'm finding it quite a challenge to read this paper from a computer screen with no people present, so I hope you'll bear with me. Hopefully, it won't be too long before we can meet face to face again. Before I begin to explore my primary concern here today, I think it may be helpful to offer you a definition of sorts. In what follows, you'll often hear me use the word practice and refer to participants as practitioners. Because the word practice has many meanings, and because my meaning is highly specific and rather complex, let me sketch how I will be using it. A practice, as I use the term, is first of all a complex but coherent set of activities that has evolved among its participants cooperatively and cumulatively over time. Secondly, it's a living set of activities that continues to evolve in ways determined by the community of its practitioners. And thirdly, it retains its vitality only to the extent that community of practitioners remains committed to sustaining, creatively developing, and extending the distinctive standards of excellence that shape and guide the practice. Practices are not just activities, then, but sets of activities distinguished by the characteristics I've listed: complexity, coherence, and distinctive standards of excellence. Practices are collective and constantly evolving, and because evolution necessarily involves change, faithful adherence to a practice involves following a constantly moving target. Perhaps most importantly, the standards of excellence at the heart of a practice take their guidance from ethical concerns about preserving the authenticity of that practice. Preservation of a living practice always takes place while it's being extended and modified in the actions of its practitioners. The ethical commitments of its practitioners are what sustain and create and sustain communities of practice. Now, there's a lot to this definition, I concede, quite a bit more than you'll need in order to follow the general thrust of my remarks here. But I hope perhaps you'll be able to return to it later and study it closely, because the ethical significance of musical and instructional practices lies at the heart of the argument I want to pursue with you here today. For now, I just ask that when you hear me use the word practice, you'll note that I'm using it in a distinctive and highly specific way. One additional word of caution. I draw a careful distinction between the term ethical and the term moral. My concern here is with the former, not the latter. I could easily devote an entire talk to the differences, but what's most important here is that you understand when I talk about ethics, I do not mean morality. Morality is about codes of conduct governed by rules of right and wrong. I hope you'll see that my claims about music's ethical potential have more to do with questions and deliberation than rules and moral rectitude. Now on to my talk. Debates over the relative merits of music's intrinsic and extrinsic values have a remarkably long history in music education. Most often, they arise amidst efforts to advocate for music's place in schooling. Unfortunately, though, these debates have generated more heat than light. Seldom do they confront the assumption that musical values can be neatly sorted into opposing categories. This is, however, an assumption I will challenge vigorously in this presentation. I will argue that the intrinsic-extrinsic dichotomy is a perniciously false one that leads to confused thinking and action, that leads to wasted time and resources, and that ultimately leads us to seriously underestimate the nature and significance of music making. That's not the kind of foundation needed by a music education profession. This is not just a theoretical concern. Our understandings of the nature and value of music and music making have highly practical implications. Implications for how we go about music making, how we teach it, how we structure curricula, how we evaluate student progress, and indeed just about everything we do as musicians or educators. Our convictions about the kind of interactions that lie at the heart of a practice are among its most crucial determinants. Clear understandings of the nature and value of music making and music education are utterly essential to professional practice. My primary concern here is to promote an understanding of music making and musical experience as fundamentally ethical resources. I want to urge that we recognize music as practices in and through which people wrestle with and seek to answer vitally important educational questions. Questions like, what kinds of demands does this practice make of me? And in turn, what kind of person is it good to be? Now, where intrinsic and extrinsic values are held to be mutually exclusive, ethical claims like the ones I want to advocate for are most oftenly relegated to a scrap heap called extrinsic or instrumental. They're regarded as diversions from the purely musical, the intrinsically musical reasons for making and engaging in music. It's time, I submit, that we begin thinking about issues like these in ways that are more productive, more musically useful, and more educationally sound. What are music's intrinsic values? On this crucial point, our thinking is remarkably evasive and slippery. The slipperiness suits the aims of music advocacy fairly well. The advocate seeks to convince skeptical others of the unqualified benefits of music making, to win support most often for things that we're already doing and want to continue doing. The success of an advocate's argument is not measured by its truth, but by its political persuasiveness. What's important is not interrogating, refining, or improving existing practices, but winning the argument. In short, appeals to intrinsic value can be tactically useful tools. But they serve primarily to justify and sustain existing habits and actions. In other words, to rationalize the status quo. After all, if music making and musical instruction are intrinsically valuable, there's no need to wrestle with thorny questions about what kind of musical and instructional practices are beneficial or how they may fall short of their potentials. They do what they do simply as functions of what they are. If music making is intrinsically good, its value is realized wherever and whenever people make music. And the purpose of music education is simply to teach music or to facilitate musical engagement. Because all music's intrinsically valuable, all music teaching and musical experience are inherently good, without qualification, regardless of how they're approached. Automatically and inevitably. End of story. However, music teaching isn't the same thing as music education. Music can be taught in ways that are not educational, in ways that indoctrinate, for instance, or that discourage the kind of critical reflection commonly attributed to education. And likewise, music can be made in ways that are not very musical. What claims to intrinsic musical and educational value tend to do, then, is exempt broad ranges of musical and instructional practice from critical scrutiny. Because their worth is intrinsic, their value is attained regardless of what music is taught, or how it's made, or how it's experienced. As I say, the advocate's sole concern is to assure that music and musical instruction receive the support they're believed to deserve. The benefits of musical endeavors don't depend on connections to anything outside the music itself. Now, this is all very neat, isn't it? A little too neat, if you ask me. Music's intrinsic values are good without qualification. Music, all of it, is important because of the things that it does, automatically and invariably, that no other human practice does. Because its value is intrinsic, music making and musical instruction are unconditionally good, again, without regard for their connections to anything else. It follows, by logic I'm not inclined to accept, that musical values are that values that are not intrinsic, those connected with extra musical concerns, are extrinsic, extraneous, non-essential, superficial, secondary. Because the ends they serve may be attained by other means, extrinsic values are less important than those that are intrinsic. In short, intrinsic musical values are legitimately musical, and values that derive from music's connection to things outside the realm of music itself are only marginally musical, if musical at all. They are extra-musical. However, when we divide human values into two distinct and opposing kinds like this, neither has much real worth. Music's intrinsic values are largely divorced from the day-to-day concerns of life and living. They're irrelevant, in other words. And its extrinsic values are not really musical. This partitioning of musical value marginalizes many of music's most powerful potentials, seriously undermining our understandings of the human import of music making and music education. The notion of value is always, I urge, value for something else. Value is always a function of the ends served. The claim that music is good in itself, then, is not just slippery, it's circular and contradictory. Worse still, it diverts our attention from issues that are critically important to our understandings and approaches to the practices of music making and music education. I think we can get along nicely without claims to intrinsic value, and doing so doesn't weaken but actually strengthens the case for music making and music education. Music making and music study are not ends in themselves, but always and necessarily means to the attainment of other human ends. Goodness, or value, is always an outcome of human acts of valuation. It consists, to put it in terms reminiscent of John Dewey's philosophical pragmatism, in acts of balancing and rebalancing ends in view. The idea of intrinsic value is a mirage, then, a smokescreen, a mere byproduct of the continuous valuing activity in which all humans engage as purposive beings. To argue that all value is value for, as I am doing, is to argue that all goods are instrumental, and is to reject the assumption that there exists a contrasting intrinsic realm of goodness. All value is instrumental. And the opposite of instrumental value is not intrinsic value, but rather the absence of value. Something can be valuable only to the extent it's contributory. This means, in turn, that all musical value is contingent, dependent upon the desirability and the demonstrable success of its contributory functions. The value of music making, and of music study, and of musical experience, and in turn of music education, are not simply given or inherent, the inevitable outcomes of participating in musical endeavors. They're good only to the extent they contribute to desired and desirable human ends. No value, no, not even musical value, is unconditional or good without regard for the ends served. If and when music is good, Its goodness is always a function of its contribution to something beyond itself. And, it follows, music making and music teaching are good only where they can be shown to enable the attainment of ends beyond music itself. Values follow only from acts of valuation. Does this mean that the distinctive features of musical experience are somehow irrelevant or dispensable to our accounts of its value? Of course not. It just means that its value depends on how its potentials, powers, and affordances are actualized in service of important human ends. These are distinctions that make a significant practical difference for musicians and educators. If we can't retreat to intrinsic value in defense of our actions, we are professionally obliged to judge the desirability of those actions in terms of their discernible benefits, their ends in view. Claims to the benefits of music making and musical experience and music study are inextricably linked to considerations like what music or whose music we have in mind, how it's taught or experienced, and what observable evidence there may be that claimed benefits are indeed being realized. Surely, though, some ends are more momentous than others. Well, of course that's so. Denying the existence of an intrinsic value does not reduce all questions of musical value to questions of popularity or matters of mere personal preference. Some of the ends served by music are clearly more humanly desirable than others. And if there's one end that trumps all others, one to which all value claims must ultimately be contributory, that end is human thriving, or as the ancient Greeks called it, eudaimonia. Thus, the best musical or educational practices are those that contribute to human thriving. And yet, there are many ways in which humans may thrive, none of which follows inexorably from a given musical action or practice. It all depends. It follows, I think, that although music in itself probably accomplishes few of the things advocates like to claim for it, it doesn't automatically or invariably make people smarter, for instance, or more sensitive, or more aesthetically aware, or more perceptive, or more considerate, or better citizens. But certain musical practices under certain conditions, undertaken in certain ways, may indeed affect outcomes that are clearly more desirable than others. As I've said, it all depends. And acknowledging the contingency of our value claims doesn't compromise or trivialize music making or music education in the least. Acknowledging that music's distinctive power may be used or abused, may serve ends that are humanly desirable or undesirable, doesn't detract in the least from music's value potentials. It only means that they're not guaranteed, and that we are obliged as professionals to attend with the utmost care to the numerous and diverse ends potentially served by musical and instructional practices. We must choose, and choose responsibly. Music names a tremendously diverse and powerful set of human practices that may serve ends both desirable and undesirable, both beneficial and detrimental to human thriving. Whether the value of a given musical or instructional practice is good or bad depends on whether, how, and to what extent it enables its practitioners or participants to thrive. Only, without something called intrinsic values to which we can retreat, that determination has to be informed and guided by carefully developed and closely monitored professional judgment. Let's review for a moment. I'm urging that we conceptualize music making and musical instruction as human practices whose value depends on whether and in what ways they distinctively enable practitioners to thrive. But musical practices are multiple and diverse, and there are numerous ways in which humans may thrive. None of these follows automatically, necessarily, or inevitably from the mere fact of musical engagement. The values potentially afforded by music making depend on the nature of the musical practices, the kind of engagement it involves, and the distinctive kind of thriving to which its authentic execution may lead. We can't escape the contributory nature of values or the ethical nature of acts of human valuation. Because all music is value for, it is always contingent. It depends on what is done and why and how. And because it's contingent, its attainment is always an open question. Choosing musical or instructional practices with a view to the ends they serve then is a pressing professional obligation. Without an intrinsic-extrinsic sorting system to guide or justify our professional actions, we must ask which among the various ends to which a given musical or instructional practice is potentially suited we will pursue, and why, and how. We must ask how that pursuit directs our actions and our decisions. We must ask what constitutes credible evidence that we are successfully achieving the ends pursued. Ethical questions are both essential and unavoidable. But precisely because of that, musical practices can be extraordinarily powerful ethical resources, tools for exploring what kind of person it's good to be. Now, implicit in what I've been arguing is a fundamental conviction that musical practices are not things or entities or technical affairs. What we designate collectively as music is rather a highly diverse family of practices, modes of human action. What count as appropriate or authentic instances of human practices cannot be prescribed because in the first place practices consist in patterns of human action. They're living affairs that take their meaning at any given time from the beliefs and attended actions of their practitioners. And because they consist in constellations of human actions that are flexible, diverse, and variable, they are also always subject to change. How much or how radically an individual practitioner's actions can diverge from those for which the practice exists is an ever open question. The variability and diversity of musical practices is crucial to their vitality and to their continuing evolution. At the same time, however, their variability and diversity are not limitless. There are restrictions as to what counts as a genuine contribution to a given practice. Negotiating porous and changing boundaries is a crucial ethical task in which all authentic practitioners engage. Deciding what kinds of actions are appropriate, are true to the ends the practice exists to serve, and which are not, are fundamental concerns for every practitioner, even though the grounds for such decisions can only be formulated tentatively or conditionally. Although this sounds abstract, I have in mind very practical concerns with which all dedicated musical practitioners are intimately familiar. Finding one's way between the unacceptable extremes of radical novelty and blind adherence to tradition, between freedom and constraint, is a fundamental part of the ethical challenges that confront every practitioner. What kind of musical actions are authentic or appropriate to a given musical practice is a question that cannot be definitively answered. We honor those who stretch the boundaries of accepted musical practice in imaginative ways, while we are critical of those who violate them with impunity or follow them slavishly. What, for instance, constitutes acceptable musical action or an authentic contribution to the practice of jazz? Who are jazz's authentic practitioners, those who are truest to the goods that jazz practices exist to serve? And who, on the other hand, are the posers, those who mimic the practice without engaging the nerve at its heart, those whose misguided efforts unwittingly degrade the practice, those who try to exploit the practice to achieve selfish ends rather than those that enhance and enrich the practice, or those whose practice is stiff, formulaic, mechanical, and predictable. I pose these questions to illustrate the kinds of deep ethical discernment that guide all human practices. At issue for those who engage passionately in practices are fundamental questions about what constitutes action that's appropriate or inappropriate, virtuous or base. Because such questions can't be answered unequivocally once and for all, irrespective of situational particulars, they invariably implicate further questions about what kind of person is good to be. Acting rightly in situations like these is not something decided outside the action demands of the practice, demands that are variable and diverse. Thus, the actions of a person who is deeply devoted to a practice are deeply linked to her character, to action habits that have been developed in service of the goods of that practice, goods that are enriched by those actions, goods achieved only through such actions. I've been concerned to dismiss the idea of intrinsic value and to emphasize what I've called value for, because of what I believe to be a crucial value claim for music making. Human practices are places where we learn and rehearse right actions in situations where what constitutes right action cannot be definitively stipulated, where we learn to address fundamental ethical questions about what kind of person it's good to be, about what kind of people we wish to become. Practices are where we learn our most important lessons about who we are and who we aspire to become. On this account, human practices are profoundly important ethical resources. And obviously, I'm urging that we think about musical practices this way. I'm suggesting, furthermore, that this presents us with considerably more potent arguments for making and studying music than, say, the development of aesthetic gratification, one version of the intrinsic myth of which I've been so critical. I'm also suggesting that it's precisely the contingency of human practices that necessitates the deep personal engagement that's intimately linked to character. And I want to go further still, suggesting that crucial among the habits developed through the ethical engagement that music making demands of us is the habit of changing our habits when change is warranted. The potentials I'm describing here attend all genuine practices, though. So why pursue specifically musical practices instead of, say, physics or carpentry or baking? This is where we do well to invoke the distinctively sonorous, bodily, and social nature of music in musical practices. Musics are highly distinctive practices that engage us more deeply and more powerfully than many others do. Musical engagement is, in many respects, a perfect example of the ethical encounter, because it consists in a process of becoming without a clear point of arrival. It asks us to draw crucial distinctions, not simply between good and bad, but among competing goods. It's resistant, complex, fragile, elusive, and deeply engaging. It demands our full presence and the deployment of all the powers at our disposal. It requires an attitude of caring and commitment an investment on our part. And because of these, it's not so much something merely done or appreciated as it is a vital part of who we are. To the extent it's successful, musical experience stands as vivid evidence of the integrity of the non-technical or practical kind of knowing on which the educated person draws abundantly and with relative fluency. Making music draws on the kind of experiential knowledge that is one with action and human agency. It requires and nurtures the kind of improvisational resourcefulness and agility that makes the educated person comfortable with the unforeseen, open to change, confident that the resources at hand can somehow be made adequate to the challenges presented by a novel situation or unanticipated circumstances. Moreover, musical experience is fundamentally social, which makes it well suited to exercising the cooperative and intersubjective understandings so crucial to attributes like tolerance, compassion, patience, and the ability to attend closely and empathetically to others. Music making is, as Charles Kyle says, our last and best source of participatory consciousness, a state sustained by, in important ways, by the participatory discrepancies among players in the musical field. It's not just social in the sense of being made with each other and of satisfying what Kyle calls the urge to merge. It's also a potent tool for constructing and maintaining social identity. As ritual enactments of human social order, music making offers us vivid evidence of the desirability of engaging with others to create and sustain intersubjective meanings, and of our mutual reliance on one another in doing so. Let me offer here a parenthetical aside, one I don't have time to explore in detail, but one that I think relates to the claims that I've been making. This global COVID pandemic that confronts us today has severely compromised live collective music making. In its place, many have turned to mediated Zoom performances. While these are interesting, what intrigues me most about them is what they invariably lack, even the best of them. They are simulacra of musical practices, efforts that have the look and sound of authentically musical endeavors but lack the ethical urgency I want to attribute to authentic musical practice. As such, they're considerably less moving or satisfying than the live practices they imitate or resemble. Now, this is admittedly a topic for another philosophical investigation, but my gut tells me these concerns are highly relevant to the participatory and ethical nature of musical practice about which I've been speaking here. Mediated performances leave me longing for the real thing, of which they are at best vivid reminders. That's the end of my aside. Music's nature as ritual becomes crucial when we return to what may be the most pivotal claim I want to make for music's ethical and educational significance. This claim is that we are what we do and do repeatedly. Music's ritualistic actions and the dispositions that undergird them are fundamental to the formation of character, both collective and individual. Music making plays a pivotal role in the social production and regulation of identity. As an important part of the machinery by which our individual and collective identities are constructed, reconstructed, maintained, and regulated, music making is far more momentous than the development of skills or aesthetic sensibility. The view on which this claim is based is a performative one that sees identities not as natural facts, but as cultural performances understood as actions that generate what they enact, doings that constitute states of being. And although I won't belabor the point here, I've explored it at length elsewhere, I believe that the unique bodily basis of musical practices imparts a potency to these value claims that's unparalleled anywhere else in human experience. I have argued against the idea of intrinsic musical value here, not with the intent of vindicating any and all extrinsic value claims, but to suggest that this way of bifurcating or partitioning values is fundamentally misguided. I've expressed serious misgivings about the validity of this dichotomy and the kinds of actions it privileges or marginalizes. My further and more pressing concern, however, has been to advance an understanding of music making and musical instruction as practices, as rich ethical resources for exploring and developing potentials of character, identity, and selfhood. It is, I believe, a significant mistake to characterize these potential values as merely extrinsic, as if there were somehow a purer realm of intrinsic musical values to which they are somehow inferior. Like all values, their importance is a function of the ways they contribute to human thriving. Whether these potentials of music making are realized or not depends fundamentally upon what or whose music is made, how it's made, and the evidence by which success is gauged. Concerns like these lie at the very heart of practical musical knowledge, but they are not musically intrinsic. Their attainment is never guaranteed. They depend fundamentally upon the choices we make, the actions we take, and our consequent understandings of what kind of people those choices and actions enable us to become. These ethical concerns, which lie at the very heart of responsible music making, are hopelessly obscured by the myth of intrinsic value. We need to take seriously the nature of musical practices, embracing the ethical concerns at their heart, concerns without which music making is reduced to mere spectacle or technical diversion, and music education is reduced to mere musical instruction. As the announcement for this conference has rightly suggested, it's imperative that music education embrace its social responsibilities, its potential for mediating and reconfiguring relationships between human beings, between cultures, between humanity and our planet. Each of these musical potentials is fundamentally instrumental. It's time, I believe, that we get over the misguided belief that there exists a realm of intrinsic musical value to which they are secondary. Thank you.